6 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 36. Ariel. I passed a sleepless night. The outrage that had been offered to me was bad enough in itself, but consequences were associated with it which might affect me more seriously still. In so far as the attainment of the one object of my life might yet depend on my personal association with Miserrimus Dexter, an unsurmountable obstacle appeared to be now placed in my way. Even in my husband's interest, ought I to permit a man who had grossly insulted me to approach me again? Although I was no prude, I recoiled from the thought of it. I arose late, and sat down at my desk, trying to summon energy enough to write to Mr. Playmore, and trying in vain. Toward noon, while Benjamin happened to be out for a little while, the housekeeper announced the arrival of another strange visitor at the gate of the villa. "It's a woman this time, ma'am, or something like one," said the worthy person, confidentially. "A great, stout, awkward, stupid creature, with a man's hat on and a man's stick in her hand. She says she has got a note for you, and she won't give it to anybody but you. I'd better not let her in, had I?" Recognizing the original of the picture, I astonished the housekeeper by consenting to receive the messenger immediately. Ariel entered the room in stolid silence as usual. But I noticed a change in her which puzzled me. Her dull eyes were red and bloodshot. Traces of tears, as I fancied, were visible on her fat, shapeless cheeks. She crossed the room, on her way to my chair, with a less determined tread than was customary with her. Could Ariel, I asked myself, be woman enough to cry? Was it within the limits of possibility that Ariel should approach me in sorrow and in fear? "I hear you've brought something for me," I said. "Won't you sit down?" She handed me a letter, without answering and without taking a chair. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was written by Miserrimus Dexter. It contained these lines: "Try to pity me, if you have any pity left for a miserable man. I have bitterly expiated the madness of a moment. If you could see me, even you would own that my punishment has been heavy enough. For God's sake, don't abandon me! I was beside myself when I let the feelings that you have awakened in me get the better of my control. It shall never show itself again. It shall be a secret that dies with me. Can I expect you to believe this? No. I won't ask you to believe me. I won't ask you to trust me in the future. If you ever consent to see me again, let it be in the presence of any third person whom you may appoint to protect you. I deserve that. I will submit to it. I will wait till time has composed your angry feeling against me. All I ask now is leave to hope. Say to Ariel, 'I forgive him, and one day I will let him see me again.' She will remember it for love of me. If you send her back without a message, you send me to the madhouse. Ask her if you don't believe me. Miserrimus Dexter." I finished the strange letter, and looked at Ariel. She stood with her eyes on the floor, and held out to me the thick walking stick which she carried in her hand. "Take the stick," were the first words she said to me. "Why am I to take it?" I asked. She struggled a little with her sluggish working mind, and slowly put her thoughts into words. "You are angry with the Master," she said. "Take it out on me. Here's the stick. Beat me." "Beat you!" I exclaimed. "My back's broad," said the poor creature. "I won't make a row. I bear it. Drat you, take the stick. Don't vex him. Whack it out on my back. Beat me." She roughly forced the stick into my hand. She turned her poor shapeless shoulders to me, waiting for the blow. It was at once dreadful and touching to see her. The tears rose in my eyes. I tried gently and patiently to reason with her. Quite useless! The idea of taking the Master's punishment on herself was the one idea in her mind. "Don't vex him," she repeated. "Beat me." "What do you mean by vexing him?" I asked. She tried to explain, and failed to find the words. She showed me by imitation, as a savage might have shown me, what she meant. Striding to the fireplace, she crouched on the rug and looked into the fire with a horrible vacant stare. Then she clasped her hands over her forehead, and rocked slowly to and fro, still staring into the fire. "There's how he sits," she said, with a sudden burst of speech. "Hours on hours, there's how he sits. Notices nobody, cries about you." The picture she presented recalled to my memory the report of Dexter's health, and the doctor's plain warning of peril waiting for him in the future. Even if I could have resisted Ariel, I must have yielded to the vague dread of consequences which now shook me in secret. "Don't do that!" I cried. She was still rocking herself in imitation of the master, and still staring into the fire with her hands on her head. "Get up, pray! I am not angry with him now. I forgive him." She rose on her hands and knees, and waited, looking up intently into my face. In that attitude, more like a dog than a human being, she repeated her customary petition, when she wanted to fix words that interested her in her mind. "Say it again." I did as she bade me. She was not satisfied. "Say it as it is in the letter," she went on. "Say it as the Master said it to me." I looked back at the letter, and repeated the form of message contained in the latter part of it, word for word. "I forgive him, and one day I will let him see me again." She sprang to her feet at a bound. For the first time since she had entered the room her dull face began to break slowly into light and life. "That's it!" she cried. "Hear if I can say it too! Hear if I got it by heart!" Teaching her exactly as I should have taught a child, I slowly fastened the message word by word on her mind. "Now rest yourself," I said, "and let me give you something to eat and drink after your long walk." I might as well have spoken to one of the chairs. She snatched up her stick from the ground, and burst out with a hoarse shout of joy. "I've got it by heart!" she cried. "This will cool the Master's head. Hooray!" She dashed out into the passage, like a wild animal escaping from its cage. I was just in time to see her tear open the garden gate, and set forth on her walk back at a pace which made it hopeless to attempt to follow and stop her. I returned to the sitting room, pondering on a question which had perplexed wiser heads than mine. Could a man who was hopelessly and entirely wicked have indeed such devoted attachment to him as Dexter had inspired in the faithful woman who had just left me? In the rough gardener who had carried him out so gently on the previous night? Who can decide? The greatest scoundrel living always has a friend, in a woman or a dog. I sat down again at my desk, and made another attempt to write to Mr. Playmore. Recalling for the purpose of my letter all that Miserrimus Dexter had said to me, my memory dwelt with special interest on the strange outbreak of feeling which had led him to betray the secret of his infatuation for Eustace's first wife. I saw again the ghastly scene in the death chamber, the deformed creature crying over the corpse in the stillness of the first dark hours of the new day. The horrible picture took a strange hold on my mind. I arose and walked up and down, and tried to turn my thoughts some other way. It was not to be done; the scene was too familiar to me to be easily dismissed. I had myself visited the room and looked at the bed. I had myself walked in the corridor which Dexter had crossed on his way to take his last leave of her. The corridor? I stopped. My thoughts suddenly took a new direction, uninfluenced by any effort of my will. What other association besides the association with Dexter did I connect with the corridor? Was it something I had seen during my visit to Gleninch? No. Was it something I had read? I snatched up the report of the trial to see. It opened at a page which contained the nurse's evidence. I read the evidence through again, without recovering the lost remembrance until I came to these lines, close at the end. Before bedtime I went upstairs to prepare the remains of the deceased lady for the coffin. The room in which she lay was locked, the door leading into Mr. Macallan's room being secured, as well as the door leading into the corridor. The keys had been taken away by Mr. Gale. Two of the men servants were posted outside the bedroom to keep watch. They were to be relieved at 4 in the morning. That was all they could tell me. There was my lost association with the corridor. There was what I ought to have remembered when Miserrimus Dexter was telling me of his visit to the dead. How had he got into the bedroom? The doors being locked, and the keys being taken away by Mr. Gale. There was but one of the locked doors of which Mr. Gale had not got the key, the door of communication between the study and the bedroom. The key was missing from this. Had it been stolen? And was Dexter the thief? He might have passed by the men on the watch while they were asleep, or he might have crossed the corridor in an unguarded interval while the men were being relieved. But how could he have got into the bedchamber except by way of the locked study door? He must have the key, and he must have secreted it weeks before Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death. When the nurse first arrived at Gleninch on the 7th of the month, her evidence declared the key of the door of communication to be then missing. To what conclusion did these considerations and discoveries point? Had Miserrimus Dexter, in a moment of ungovernable agitation, unconsciously placed the clue in my hands? Was the pivot on which turned the whole mystery of the poisoning at Gleninch the missing key? I went back for the third time to my desk. The one person who might be trusted to find the answer to those questions was Mr. Playmore. I wrote him a full and careful account of all that had happened. I begged him to forgive and forget my ungracious reception of the advice which he had so kindly offered to me; and I promised beforehand to do nothing without first consulting his opinion in the new emergency which now confronted me. The day was fine for the time of year; and by way of getting a little wholesome exercise after the surprises and occupations of the morning, I took my letter to Mr. Playmore to the post. Returning to the villa, I was informed that another visitor was waiting to see me a civilized visitor this time, who had given her name my mother in law, Mrs. Macallan. Chapter 36. Of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 37. At the Bedside. Before she had uttered a word, I saw in my mother-in-law's face that she brought bad news. "Eustace?" I said. She answered me by a look. "Let me hear it at once," I cried. "I can bear anything but suspense." Mrs. Macallan lifted her hand, and showed me a telegraphic dispatch which she had hitherto kept concealed in the folds of her dress. "I can trust your courage," she said. "There is no need, my child, to prevaricate with you. Read that." I read the telegram. It was sent by the chief surgeon of a field hospital, and it was dated from a village in the north of Spain. "Mr. Eustace severely wounded in a skirmish by a stray shot. Not in danger so far. Every care taken of him. Wait for another telegram." I turned away my face, and bore as best I might the pang that wrung me when I read those words. I thought I knew how dearly I loved him. I had never known it till that moment. My mother-in-law put her arm round me, and held me to her tenderly. She knew me well enough not to speak to me at that moment. I rallied my courage, and pointed to the last sentence in the telegram. "Do you mean to wait?" I asked. "Not a day," she answered. "I am going to the Foreign Office about my passport. I have some interest there. They can give me letters, they can advise and assist me. I leave to night by the mail train to Calais." "You leave?" I said. "Do you suppose I will let you go without me? Get my passport when you get yours. At 7 this evening I shall be at your house." She attempted to remonstrate; she spoke of the perils of the journey. At the first words I stopped her. "Don't you know yet, mother, how obstinate I am? They may keep you waiting at the Foreign Office. Why do you waste the precious hours here?" She yielded with a gentleness that was not in her everyday character. "Will my poor Eustace ever know what a wife he's got?" That was all she said. She kissed me, and went away in her carriage. My remembrances of our journey are strangely vague and imperfect. As I try to recall them, the memory of those more recent and more interesting events which occurred after my return to England gets between me and my adventures in Spain, and seems to force these last into a shadowy background until they look like adventures that happened many years since. I confusedly recollect delays and alarms that tried our patience and our courage. I remember our finding friends, thanks to our letters of recommendation, in a secretary to the Embassy and in a Queen's Messenger, who assisted and protected us at a critical point in the journey. I recall to mind a long succession of men in our employment as travelers, all equally remarkable for their dirty cloaks and their clean linen, for their highly civilized courtesy to women and their utterly barbarous cruelty to horses. Last, and most important of all, I see again, more clearly than I can see anything else, the one wretched bedroom of a squalid village inn in which we found our poor darling, prostrate between life and death, insensible to everything that passed in the narrow little world that lay around his bedside. There was nothing romantic or interesting in the accident which had put my husband's life in peril. He had ventured too near the scene of the conflict, a miserable affair, to rescue a poor lad who lay wounded on the field. mortally wounded, as the event proved. A rifle bullet had struck him in the body. His brethren of the field hospital had carried him back to their quarters at the risk of their lives. He was a great favorite with all of them, patient and gentle and brave, only wanting a little more judgment to be the most valuable recruit who had joined the brotherhood. In telling me this, the surgeon kindly and delicately added a word of warning as well. The fever caused by the wound had brought with it delirium, as usual. My poor husband's mind, in so far as his wandering words might interpret it, was filled by the one image of his wife. The medical attendant had heard enough in the course of his ministrations at the bedside to satisfy him that any sudden recognition of me by Eustace, if he recovered, might be attended by the most lamentable results. As things were at that sad time, I might take my turn at nursing him without the slightest chance of his discovering me, perhaps for weeks and weeks to come. But on the day when he was declared out of danger, if that happy day ever arrived, I must resign my place at his bedside, and must wait to show myself until the surgeon gave me leave. My mother-in-law and I relieved each other regularly, day and night, in the sick room. In the hours of his delirium, hours that recurred with a pitiless regularity, my name was always on my poor darling's fevered lips. The ruling idea in him was the fine dreadful idea which I had vainly combated at our last interview. In the face of the verdict pronounced at the trial, it was impossible even for his wife to be really and truly persuaded that he was an innocent man. All the wild pictures which his distempered imagination drew were equally inspired by that one obstinate conviction. He fancied himself to be still living with me under those dreadful conditions. Do what he might, I was always recalling to him the terrible ordeal through which he had passed. He acted his part, and he acted mine. He gave me a cup of tea, and I said to him, "We quarreled yesterday, Eustace. Is it poisoned?" He kissed me in token of our reconciliation, and I laughed, and said, "It's morning now, my dear. Shall I die by 9 o'clock to-night?" I was ill in bed, and he gave me my medicine. I looked at him with a doubting eye. I said to him, "You are in love with another woman. Is there anything in the medicine that the doctor doesn't know of?" Such was the horrible drama which now perpetually acted itself in his mind. Hundreds and hundreds of times I heard him repeat it, almost always in the same words. On other occasions his thoughts wandered away to my desperate project of proving him to be an innocent man. Sometimes he laughed at it. Sometimes he mourned over it. Sometimes he devised cunning schemes for placing unsuspected obstacles in my way. He was especially hard on me when he was inventing his preventive stratagems. He cheerfully instructed the visionary people who assisted him not to hesitate at offending or distressing me. "Never mind if you make her angry. Never mind if you make her cry. It's all for her good. It's all to save the poor fool from dangers she doesn't dream of. You mustn't pity her when she says she does it for my sake. See, she is going to be insulted. She is going to be deceived. She is going to disgrace herself without knowing it. Stop her! Stop her!" It was weak of me, I know. I ought to have kept the plain fact that he was out of his senses always present to my mind. Still it's true that my hours passed at my husband's pillow were many of them hours of mortification and misery of which he, poor dear, was the innocent and only cause. The weeks passed, and he still hovered between life and death. I kept no record of the time, and I cannot now recall the exact date on which the first favorable change took place. I only remember that it was towards sunrise on a fine winter morning, when we were relieved at last of our heavy burden of suspense. The surgeon happened to be by the bedside when his patient awoke. The first thing he did, after looking at Eustace, was to caution me by a sign to be silent, and to keep out of sight. My mother-in-law and I both knew what this meant. With full hearts we thanked God together for giving us back the husband and the son. The same evening, being alone, we ventured to speak of the future, for the first time since we had left home. "The surgeon tells me," said Mrs. Macallan, "that Eustace is too weak to be capable of bearing anything in the nature of a surprise for some days to come. We have time to consider whether he is or is not to be told that he owes his life as much to your care as to mine. Can you find it in your heart to leave him, Valeria, now that God's mercy has restored him to you and to me?" "If I only consulted my own heart," I answered, "I should never leave him again." Mrs. Macallan looked at me in grave surprise. "What else have you to consult?" she asked. "If we both live," I replied, "I have to think of the happiness of his life and the happiness of mine in the years that are to come. I can bear a great deal, mother, but I cannot endure the misery of his leaving me for the second time." "You wrong him, Valeria. I firmly believe you wrong him, in thinking it possible that he can leave you again." "Dear Mrs. Macallan, have you forgotten already what we have both heard him say of me while we have been sitting by his bedside?" "We have heard the ravings of a man in delirium. It is surely hard to hold Eustace responsible for what he said when he was out of his senses." "It is harder still," I said, "to resist his mother when she is pleading for him. Dearest and best of friends, I don't hold Eustace responsible for what he said in his fever, but I do take warning by it. The wildest words that fell from him were, one and all, the faithful echo of what he said to me in the best days of his health and his strength. What hope have I that he will recover with an altered mind toward me? Absence has not changed it, suffering has not changed it. In the delirium of fever, and in the full possession of his reason, he has the same dreadful doubt of me. I see but one way of winning him back. I must destroy at its roots his motive for leaving me. It is hopeless to persuade him that I believe in his innocence. I must show him that belief is no longer necessary. I must prove to him that his position toward me has become the position of an innocent man." "Valeria, Valeria, you are wasting time and words. You have tried the experiment, and you know as well as I do that the thing is not to be done." I had no answer to that. I could say no more than I had said already. "Suppose you go back to Dexter, out of sheer compassion for a mad and miserable wretch who has already insulted you," proceeded my mother in law. "You can only go back accompanied by me, or by some other trustworthy person. You can only stay long enough to humor the creature's wayward fancy, and to keep his crazy brain quiet for a time. That done, all is done. You leave him. Even supposing Dexter to be still capable of helping you, how can you make use of him but by admitting him to terms of confidence and familiarity? By treating him, in short, on the footing of an intimate friend? Answer me honestly. Can you bring yourself to do that, after what happened at Mr. Benjamin's house?" I had told her of my last interview with Miserrimus Dexter, in the natural confidence that she inspired in me as a relative and fellow traveler; and this was the use to which she turned her information. I suppose I had no right to blame her. I suppose the motive sanctioned everything. At any rate, I had no choice but to give offense or to give an answer. I gave it. I acknowledged that I could never again permit Miserrimus Dexter to treat me on terms of familiarity as a trusted and intimate friend. Mrs. Macallan pitilessly pressed the advantage that she had won. "Very well," she said. "That resource being no longer open to you, what hope is left? Which way are you to turn next?" There was no meeting those questions, in my present situation, by any adequate reply. I felt strangely unlike myself. I submitted in silence. Mrs. Macallan struck the last blow that completed her victory. "My poor Eustace is weak and wayward," she said. "But he is not an ungrateful man. My child, you have returned him good for evil. You have proved how faithfully and how devotedly you love him, by suffering all hardships and risking all dangers for his sake. Trust me, and trust him. He cannot resist you. Let him see the dear face that he has been dreaming of looking at him again, with all the old love in it, and he is yours once more, my daughter, yours for life." She rose and touched my forehead with her lips. Her voice sank to tones of tenderness which I had never heard from her yet. "Say yes, Valeria," she whispered, "and be dearer to me and dearer to him than ever." My heart sided with her. My energies were worn out. No letter had arrived from Mr. Playmore to guide and to encourage me. I had resisted so long and so vainly, I had tried and suffered so much, I had met with such cruel disasters and such reiterated disappointments, and he was in the room beneath me, feebly finding his way back to consciousness and to life. How could I resist? It was all over. In saying yes, if Eustace confirmed his mother's confidence in him, I was saying adieu to the one cherished ambition, the one dear and noble hope of my life. I knew it, and I said yes. And so good-bye to the grand struggle, and so welcome to the new resignation which owned that I had failed. My mother-in-law and I slept together under the only shelter that the inn could offer to us, a sort of loft at the top of the house. The night that followed our conversation was bitterly cold. We felt the chilly temperature in spite of the protection of our dressing-gowns and our travelling wrappers. My mother-in-law slept, but no rest came to me. I was too anxious and too wretched, thinking over my changed position, and doubting how my husband would receive me, to be able to sleep. Some hours, as I suppose, must have passed, and I was still absorbed in my own melancholy thoughts, when I suddenly became conscious of a new and strange sensation which astonished and alarmed me. I started up in the bed, breathless and bewildered. The movement awakened Mrs. Macallan. "Are you ill?" she asked. "What is the matter with you?" I tried to tell her as well as I could. She seemed to understand me before I had done. She took me tenderly in her arms, and pressed me to her bosom. "My poor innocent child!" she said. "Is it possible you don't know? Must I really tell you?" She whispered her next words. Shall I ever forget the tumult of feelings which the whisper aroused in me? The strange medley of joy and fear, and wonder and relief, and pride and humility, which filled my whole being, and made a new woman of me from that moment? Now, for the first time, I knew it. If God spared me for a few months more, the most enduring and the most sacred of all human joys might be mine, the joy of being a mother. I don't know how the rest of the night passed. I only find my memory again when the morning came, and when I went out by myself to breathe the crisp wintry air on the open moor behind the inn. I have said that I felt like a new woman. The morning found me with a new resolution and a new courage. When I thought of the future, I had not only my husband to consider now. His good name was no longer his own or mine. It might soon become the most precious inheritance that he could leave to his child. What had I done while I was in ignorance of this? I had resigned the hope of cleansing his name from the stain that rested on it, a stain still, no matter how little it might look in the eye of the law. Our child might live to hear malicious tongues say, "Your father was tried for the vilest of all murders, and was never absolutely acquitted of the charge." Could I face the glorious perils of childbirth with that possibility present to my mind? No, not until I had made one more effort to lay the conscience of Miserrimus Dexter bare to my view; not until I had once again renewed the struggle, and brought the truth that vindicated the husband and the father to the light of day. I went back to the house, with my new courage to sustain me. I opened my heart to my friend and mother, and told her frankly of the change that had come over me since we had last spoken of Eustace. She was more than disappointed; she was almost offended with me. The one thing needful had happened, she said. The happiness that might soon come to us would form a new tie between my husband and me. Every other consideration but this she treated as purely fanciful. If I left Eustace now, I did a heartless thing and a foolish thing. I should regret to the end of my days having thrown away the one golden opportunity of my married life. It cost me a hard struggle, it oppressed me with many a painful doubt, but I held firm this time. The honor of the father, the inheritance of the child, I kept these thoughts as constantly as possible before my mind. Sometimes they failed me, and left me nothing better than a poor fool who had some fitful bursts of crying, and was always ashamed of herself afterward. But my native obstinacy, as Mrs. Macallan said, carried me through. Now and then I had a peep at Eustace while he was asleep, and that helped me too. Though they made my heart ache and shook me sadly at the times, those furtive visits to my husband fortified me afterwards. I cannot explain how this happened. It seems so contradictory. I can only repeat it as one of my experiences at that troubled time. I made one concession to Mrs. Macallan. I consented to wait for 2 days before I took any steps for returning to England, on the chance that my mind might change in the interval. It was well for me that I yielded so far. On the second day the director of the field hospital sent to the post office at our nearest town for letters addressed to him or to his care. The messenger brought back a letter for me. I thought I recognized the handwriting, and I was right. Mr. Playmore's answer had reached me at last. If I had been in any danger of changing my mind, the good lawyer would have saved me in the nick of time. The extract that follows contains the pith of his letter, and shows how he encouraged me when I stood in sore need of a few cheering and friendly words. "Let me tell you now," he wrote, "what I have done toward verifying the conclusion to which your letter points. I have traced one of the servants who was appointed to keep watch in the corridor on the night when the first Mrs. Eustace died at Gleninch. The man perfectly remembers that Miserrimus Dexter suddenly appeared before him and his fellow servant long after the house was quiet for the night. Dexter said to him, 'I suppose there is no harm in going into the study to read. I can't sleep after what has happened. I must relieve my mind somehow.' The men had no orders to keep any one out of the study. They knew that the door of communication with the bedchamber was locked, and that the keys of the 2 other doors of communication were in the possession of Mr. Gale. They accordingly permitted Dexter to go into the study. He closed the door that opened on the corridor, and remained absent for some time, in the study as the men supposed, in the bedchamber as we know from what he let out at his interview with you. Now he could enter that room, as you rightly imagine, in but one way by being in possession of the missing key. How long he remained there, I cannot discover. The point is of little consequence. The servant remembers that he came out of the study again, as pale as death, and that he passed on without a word on his way back to his own room. These are facts. The conclusion to which they lead is serious in the last degree. It justifies everything that I confided to you in my office at Edinburgh. You remember what passed between us. I say no more. As to yourself next. You have innocently aroused in Miserrimus Dexter a feeling toward you which I need not attempt to characterize. There is a certain something I saw it myself in your figure and in some of your movements, which does recall the late Mrs. Eustace to those who knew her well, and which has evidently had its effect on Dexter's morbid mind. Without dwelling further on the subject, let me only remind you that he has shown himself, as a consequence of your influence over him, to be incapable, in his moments of agitation, of thinking before he speaks while he is in your presence. It is not merely possible, it is highly probable, that he may betray himself far more seriously than he has betrayed himself yet, if you give him the opportunity. I owe it to you, knowing what your interests are, to express myself plainly on this point. I have no sort of doubt that you have advanced one step nearer to the end which you have in view in the brief interval since you left Edinburgh. I see in your letter, and in my discoveries, irresistible evidence that Dexter must have been in secret communication with the deceased lady innocent communication, I am certain, so far as she was concerned not only at the time of her death, but perhaps for weeks before it. I cannot disguise from myself or from you my own strong persuasion that if you succeed in discovering the nature of this communication, in all human likelihood you prove your husband's innocence by the discovery of the truth. As an honest man, I am bound not to conceal this. And, as an honest man also, I am equally bound to add that, not even with your reward in view, can I find it in my conscience to advise you to risk what you must risk if you see Miserrimus Dexter again. In this difficult and delicate matter, I cannot and will not take the responsibility. The final decision must rest with yourself. One favour only I entreat you to grant. Let me hear what you resolve to do as soon as you know it yourself. The difficulties which my worthy correspondent felt were no difficulties to me. I did not possess Mr. Playmore's judicial mind. My resolution was settled before I had read his letter through. The mail to France crossed the frontier the next day. There was a place for me, under the protection of the conductor, if I chose to take it. Without consulting a living creature, rash as usual, headlong as usual, I took it. End of chapter 37. 38 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 38. On the Journey Back. If I had been traveling homeward in my own carriage, the remaining chapters of this narrative would never have been written. Before we had been an hour on the road, I should have called to the driver, and should have told him to turn back. Who can be always resolute? In asking that question, I speak of the women, not of the men. I had been resolute in turning a deaf ear to Mr. Playmore's doubts and cautions, resolute in holding out against my mother in law, resolute in taking my place by the French mail. Until 10 minutes after we had driven away from the inn my courage held out, and then it failed me. Then I said to myself, "You wretch, you've deserted your husband!" For hours afterward, if I could have stopped the mail, I would have done it. I hated the conductor, the kindest of men. I hated the Spanish ponies that drew us, the cheeriest animals that ever jingled a string of bells. I hated the bright day that would make things pleasant, and the bracing air that forced me to feel the luxury of breathing, whether I liked it or not. Never was a journey more miserable than my safe and easy journey to the frontier. But one little comfort helped me to bear my heartache resignedly a stolen morsel of Eustace's hair. We had started at an hour of the morning when he was still sound asleep. I could creep into his room and kiss him, and cry over him softly, and cut off a stray lock of his hair, without danger of discovery. How I summoned resolution enough to leave him is, to this hour, not clear to my mind. I think my mother in law must have helped me, without meaning to do it. She came into the room with an erect head and a cold eye. She said, with an unmerciful emphasis on the word, "If you mean to go, Valeria, the carriage is here." Any woman with a spark of spirit in her would have meant it under those circumstances. I meant it, and did it. And then I was sorry for it. Poor humanity! Time's got all the credit of being the great consoler of afflicted mortals. In my opinion, Time has been overrated in this matter. Distance does the same beneficent work far more speedily, and, when assisted by change, far more effectually as well. On the railroad to Paris, I became capable of taking a sensible view of my position. I could now remind myself that my husband's reception of me, after the first surprise and the first happiness had passed away, might not have justified his mother's confidence in him. Admitting that I ran a risk in going back to Miserrimus Dexter, should I not have been equally rash in another way if I had returned uninvited to a husband who had declared that our conjugal happiness was impossible, and that our married life was at an end? Besides, who could say that the events of the future might not yet justify me, not only to myself but to him? I might yet hear him say, "She was inquisitive when she had no business to inquire. She was obstinate when she ought to have listened to reason. She left my bedside when other women would have remained. But in the end she atoned for it all. She turned out to be right." I rested a day in Paris, and wrote 3 letters. One to Benjamin, telling him to expect me the next evening. One to Mr. Playmore, warning him in good time that I meant to take a last effort to penetrate the mystery at Gleninch. One to Eustace, of a few lines only, owning that I had helped to nurse him through the dangerous part of his illness, confessing the one reason which had prevailed with me to leave him, and entreating him to suspend his opinion of me until time had proved that I loved him more dearly than ever. This last letter I enclosed to my mother in law, leaving it to her discretion to choose the right time for giving it to her son. I positively forbade Mrs. Macallan, however, to tell Eustace of the new tie between us. Although he had separated himself from me, I was determined that he should not hear it from other lips than mine. Never mind why. There are certain little matters which I must keep to myself, and this is one of them. My letters being written, my duty was done. I was free to play my last card in the game. the darkly doubtful game which was neither quite for me nor quite against me as the chances now stood. Chapter 38. Of the Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 39. On the Way to Dexter. I declare to Heaven, Valeria, I believe that monster's madness is infectious, and you've caught it. This was Benjamin's opinion of me, on my safe arrival at the villa, after I had announced my intention of returning Miserrimus Dexter's visit in his company. Being determined to carry my point, I could afford to try the influence of mild persuasion. I begged my good friend to have a little patience with me. "And do remember what I have already told you," I added. "It is of serious importance to me to see Dexter again." I only heaped fuel on the fire. "See him again?" Benjamin repeated indignantly. "See him, after he grossly insulted you, under my roof, in this very room? I can't be awake; I must be asleep and dreaming." It was wrong of me, I know. But Benjamin's virtuous indignation was so very virtuous that it let the spirit of mischief loose in me. I really could not resist the temptation to outrage his sense of propriety by taking an audaciously liberal view of the whole matter. "Gently, my good friend, gently," I said. "We must make allowances for a man who suffers under Dexter's infirmities and lives Dexter's life. And really we must not let our modesty lead us beyond reasonable limits. I begin to think that I took rather a prudish view of the thing myself at the time. A woman who respects herself, and whose whole heart is with her husband, is not so very seriously injured when a wretched crippled creature is rude enough to put his arm around her waist. Virtuous indignation, if I may venture to say so, is sometimes very cheap indignation. Besides, I have forgiven him, and you must forgive him too. There is no fear of his forgetting himself again while you are with me. His house is quite a curiosity. It's sure to interest you. The pictures alone are worth the journey. I will write to him to-day, and we will go and see him together to-morrow. We owe it to ourselves, if we don't owe it to Mr. Dexter, to pay this visit. If you will look about you, Benjamin, you will see that benevolence towards everybody is the great virtue of the time we live in. Poor Mr. Dexter must have the benefit of the prevailing fashion. Come, come, march with the age, open your mind to the new ideas." Instead of accepting this polite invitation, worthy old Benjamin flew at the age we lived in like a bull at a red cloth. "Oh, the new ideas, the new ideas! By all manner of means, Valeria, let's have the new ideas. The old morality is all wrong, the old ways are all worn out. Let's march with the age we live in. Nothing comes amiss to the age we live in. The wife in England and the husband in Spain, married or not married, living together or not living together, it's all one to the new ideas. I will go with you, Valeria. I'll be worthy of the generation I live in. When we have done with Dexter, don't let's do things by halves. Let's go and get crammed with ready-made science at a lecture. Let's hear the last new professor, the man who has been behind the scenes at creation, and knows to a T how the world was made, and how long it took to make it. There's the other fellow, too. Mind we don't forget the modern Solomon, who has left his proverbs behind him, the brand-new philosopher who considers the consolation of religion in the light of harmless playthings, and who is kind enough to say that he might have been all the happier if he could only have been childish enough to play with them himself. Oh, the new ideas, the new ideas! What consoling, elevating, beautiful discoveries have been made by the new ideas! We were all monkeys before we were men, and molecules before we were monkeys. And what does it matter? And what does anything matter to anybody? I'm with you, Valeria. I'm ready. The sooner the better. Come to Dexter, come to Dexter. "I am so glad you agree with me," I said. "But let's do nothing in a hurry. 3 o'clock to-morrow will be time enough for Mr. Dexter. I will write at once, and tell him to expect us." "Where are you going?" "I am going to clear my mind of cant," said Benjamin sternly. "I am going into the library." "What are you going to read?" "I am going to read Puss in Boots, and Jack and the Beanstalk, and anything else I can find that doesn't march with the age we live in." With that parting shot at the new ideas, my old friend left me for a time. Having dispatched my note, I found myself beginning to revert, with a certain feeling of anxiety, to the subject of Miserrimus Dexter's health. How had he passed through the interval of my absence from England? Could anybody within my reach tell me news of him? To inquire of Benjamin would only be to provoke a new outbreak. While I was still considering, the housekeeper entered the room on some domestic errand. I asked, at a venture, if she had heard anything more, while I had been away, of the extraordinary person who had so seriously alarmed her on a former occasion. The housekeeper shook her head, and looked as if she thought it in bad taste to mention the subject at all. "About a week after you'd gone away, ma'am," she said, with extreme severity of manner, and with excessive carefulness in her choice of words, "the person you mention had the impudence to send a letter to you. The messenger was informed, by my master's orders, that you had gone abroad, and he and his letter were both sent about their business together. Not long afterward, ma'am, I happened, while drinking tea with Mrs. Macallan's housekeeper, to hear of the person again. He himself called in his chaise at Mrs. Macallan's to inquire about you there. How he can contrive to sit without legs to balance him is beyond my understanding, but that's neither here nor there. Legs or no legs, the housekeeper saw him, and she says, as I say, she will never forget him to her dying day. She told him, as soon as she recovered herself, of Mr. Eustace's illness, and of you and Mrs. Macallan being in foreign parts, nursing him. He went away, so the housekeeper told me, with tears in his eyes, and oaths and curses on his lips, a sight shocking to see. That's all I know about the person, ma'am, and I hope to be excused if I venture to say that the subject is, for good reasons, extremely disagreeable to me." She made a formal curtsey, and quitted the room. Left by myself, I felt more anxious and more uncertain than ever when I thought of the experiment that was to be tried on the next day. Making due allowances for exaggeration, the description of Miserrimus Dexter on his departure from Mrs. Macallan's house suggested that he had not endured my long absence very patiently, and that he was still as far as ever from giving his shattered nervous system its fair chance of repose. The next morning brought me Mr. Playmore's reply to the letter which I had addressed to him from Paris. He wrote very briefly, neither approving nor blaming my decision, but strongly reiterating his opinion that I should do well to choose a competent witness as my companion on my coming interview with Dexter. The most interesting part of the letter was at the end. "You must be prepared," Mr. Playmore wrote, "to see a change for the worse in Dexter. A friend of mine was with him on a matter of business a few days since, and was struck by the alteration in him. Your presence is sure to have its effect, one way or another. I can give you no instructions for managing him; you must be guided by the circumstances. Your own tact will tell you whether it is wise or not to encourage him to speak of the late Mrs. Eustace. The chances of his betraying himself all revolve, as I think, round that one topic. Keep him to it if you can." To this was added, in a postscript: "Ask Mr. Benjamin if he were near enough to the library door to hear Dexter tell you of his entering the bedchamber on the night of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death." I put the question to Benjamin when we met at the luncheon table before setting forth for the distant suburb in which Miserrimus Dexter lived. My old friend disapproved of the contemplated expedition as strongly as ever. He was unusually grave and unusually sparing of his words when he answered me. "I am no listener," he said; "but some people have voices which insist on being heard. Mr. Dexter is one of them." "Does that mean that you heard him?" I asked. "The door couldn't muffle him, and the wall couldn't muffle him," Benjamin rejoined. "I heard him, and I thought it infamous. There!" "I may want you to do more than hear him this time," I ventured to say. "I may want you to make notes of our conversation while Mr. Dexter is speaking to me. You used to write down what my father said, when he was dictating his letters to you. Have you got one of your little note books to spare?" Benjamin looked up from his plate with an aspect of stern surprise. "It is one thing," he said, "to write under the dictation of a great merchant, conducting a vast correspondence by which thousands of pounds change hands in due course of post. And it's another thing to take down the gibberish of a maundering mad monster who ought to be kept in a cage. Your good father, Valeria, would never have asked me to do that. Forgive me, Benjamin. I must really ask you to do it. You may be of the greatest possible use to me. Come, give way this once, dear, for my sake." Benjamin looked down again at his plate, with a rueful resignation which told me that I had carried my point. "I've been tied to her apron string all my life," I heard him grumble to himself; "and it's too late in the day to get loose from her now." He looked up again at me. "I thought I had retired from business," he said; "but it seems I must turn clerk again. Well, what's the new stroke of work that's expected from me this time?" The cab was announced to be waiting for us at the gate as he asked the question. I rose and took his arm, and gave him a grateful kiss on his rosy old cheek. "Only two things," I said. "Sit down behind Mr. Dexter's chair, so that he can't see you. But take care to place yourself at the same time so that you can see me." "The less I see of Mr. Dexter the better I shall be pleased," growled Benjamin. "What am I to do after I have taken my place behind him?" "You are to wait until I make you a sign. And when you see it, you are to begin writing down in your note book what Mr. Dexter is saying. And you are to go on until I make another sign which means 'leave off.'" "Well," said Benjamin, "what's the sign for 'begin'? And what's the sign for 'leave off'?" I was not quite prepared with an answer to this. I asked him to help me with a hint. No, Benjamin would take no active part in the matter. He was resigned to be employed in the capacity of passive instrument, and there all concession ended so far as he was concerned. Left to my own resources, I found it no easy matter to invent a telegraphic system which should sufficiently inform Benjamin without awakening Dexter's quick suspicion. I looked into the glass to see if I could find the necessary suggestion in anything that I wore. My earrings supplied me with the idea of which I was in search. "I shall take care to sit in an armchair," I said. "When you see me rest my elbow on the chair, and lift my hand to my earring, as if I were playing with it, write down what he says, and go on until well, suppose we say until you hear me move my chair. At that sound, stop. You understand me?" "I understand you." We started for Dexter's house. End of Chapter 39. 40 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 40. Nemesis at last. The gardener opened the gate to us on this occasion. He had evidently received his orders in anticipation of my arrival. "Mrs. Valeria?" he asked. "Yes." "And friend?" "And friend." "Please to step upstairs. You know the house." Crossing the hall, I stopped for a moment and looked at a favorite walking cane which Benjamin still kept in his hand. "Your cane will only be in your way," I said. "Had you not better leave it here?" "My cane may be useful upstairs," retorted Benjamin gruffly. "I haven't forgotten what happened in the library." It was no time to contend with him. I led the way up the stairs. Arriving at the upper flight of stairs, I was startled by hearing a sudden cry from the room above. It was like the cry of a person in pain, and it was twice repeated before we entered the circular antechamber. I was the first to approach the inner room, and to see the many-sided Miserrimus Dexter in another new aspect of his character. The unfortunate Ariel was standing before a table, with a dish of little cakes placed in front of her. Round each of her wrists was tied a string, the free ends of which, at a distance of a few yards, were held in Miserrimus Dexter's hands. "Try again, my beauty," I heard him say, as I stopped on the threshold of the door. "Take a cake." At the word of command, Ariel submissively stretched out one arm toward the dish. Just as she touched a cake with the tips of her fingers, her hand was jerked away by a pull at the string, so savagely cruel in the nimble and devilish violence of it, that I felt inclined to snatch Benjamin's cane out of his hand and break it over Miserrimus Dexter's back. Ariel suffered the pain this time in Spartan silence. The position in which she stood enabled her to be the first to see me at the door. She had discovered me. Her teeth were set; her face was flushed under the struggle to restrain herself. Not even a sigh escaped her in my presence. "Drop the string!" I called out indignantly. "Release her, Mr. Dexter, or I shall leave the house!" At the sound of my voice he burst out with a shrill cry of welcome. His eyes fastened on me with a fierce, devouring delight. "Come in! Come in!" he cried. "See what I am reduced to in the maddening suspense of waiting for you! See how I kill the time when the time parts us! Come in! Come in! I am in one of my malicious humours this morning, caused entirely, Mrs. Valeria, by my anxiety to see you. When I am in my malicious humours, I must tease something. I am teasing Ariel. Look at her! She has had nothing to eat all day, and she hasn't been quick enough to snatch a morsel of cake yet. You needn't pity her. Ariel has no nerves. I don't hurt her." "Ariel has no nerves," echoed the poor creature, frowning at me for interfering between her master and herself. "He doesn't hurt me." I heard Benjamin beginning to swing his cane behind him. "Drop the string!" I reiterated, more vehemently than ever. "Drop it, or I shall instantly leave you." Miserrimus Dexter's delicate nerves shuddered at my violence. "What a glorious voice!" he exclaimed, and dropped the string. "Take the cakes," he added, addressing Ariel in his most imperial manner. She passed me, with the strings hanging from her swollen wrists, and the dish of cakes in her hand. She nodded her head at me defiantly. "Ariel has got no nerves," she repeated proudly. "He doesn't hurt me." "You see," said Miserrimus Dexter, "there is no harm done; and I dropped the strings when you told me. Don't begin by being hard on me, Mrs. Valeria, after your long absence." He paused. Benjamin, standing silent in the doorway, attracted his attention for the first time. "Who is this?" he asked, and wheeled his chair suspiciously nearer to the door. "Oh, I know!" he cried, before I could answer. "This is the benevolent gentleman who looked like the refuge of the afflicted when I saw him last. You have altered for the worse since then, sir. You have stepped into quite a new character. You personify retributive justice now. Your new protector, Mrs. Valeria, I understand." He bowed low to Benjamin, with ferocious irony. "Your humble servant, Mr. Retributive Justice. I have deserved you, and I submit to you. Walk in, sir. I will take care that your new office shall be a sinecure. This lady is the light of my life. Catch me failing in respect to her if you can." He backed his chair before Benjamin, who listened to him in contemptuous silence, until he reached the part of the room in which I was standing. "Your hand, light of my life," he murmured in his gentlest tones. "Your hand, only to show that you have forgiven me." I gave him my hand. "One," he whispered entreatingly. "Only one?" He kissed my hand, once, respectfully, and dropped it with a heavy sigh. "Ah, poor Dexter!" he said, pitying himself with the whole sincerity of his egotism. "A warm heart wasted in solitude, mocked by deformity. Sad, sad! Oh, poor Dexter!" He looked round again at Benjamin, with another flash of his ferocious irony. "A beauteous day, sir," he said, with mock conversational courtesy. "Seasonable weather indeed, after the late long continued rains. Can I offer you any refreshment? Won't you sit down? Retributive justice, when it is no taller than you are, looks best in a chair." "And a monkey looks best in a cage," rejoined Benjamin, enraged at the satirical reference to his shortness of stature. "I was waiting, sir, to see you get into your swing." The retort produced no effect on Miserrimus Dexter. It appeared to have passed by him unheard. He had changed again; he was thoughtful; he was subdued. His eyes were fixed on me with a sad and rapt attention. I took the nearest arm chair, first casting a glance at Benjamin, which he immediately understood. He placed himself behind Dexter, at an angle which commanded a view of my chair. Ariel, silently devouring her cakes, crouched on a stool at the master's feet, and looked up at him like a faithful dog. There was an interval of quiet and repose. I was able to observe Miserrimus Dexter uninterruptedly for the first time since I had entered the room. I was not surprised. I was nothing less than alarmed by the change for the worse in him since we had last met. Mr. Playmore's letter had not prepared me for the serious deterioration in him which I could now discern. His features were pinched and worn. The whole face seemed to have wasted strangely in substance and size since I had last seen it. The softness in his eyes was gone. Blood-red veins were intertwined all over them now. They were set in a piteous and vacant stare. His once firm hands looked withered. They trembled as they lay on the coverlet. The paleness of his face, exaggerated perhaps by the black velvet jacket that he wore, had a sodden and sickly look. The fine outline was gone. The multitudinous little wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had deepened. His head sank into his shoulders when he leaned forward in his chair. Years appeared to have passed over him, instead of months, while I had been absent from England. Remembering the medical report which Mr. Playmore had given me to read, recalling the doctor's positively declared opinion that the preservation of Dexter's sanity depended on the healthy condition of his nerves, I could not but feel that I had done wisely, if I might still hope for success, in hastening my return from Spain. Knowing what I knew, fearing what I feared, I believed that his time was near. I felt, when our eyes met by accident, that I was looking at a doomed man. I pitied him. Yes, yes, I know that compassion for him was utterly inconsistent with the motive which had taken me to his house, utterly inconsistent with the doubt still present to my mind whether Mr. Playmore had really wronged him in believing that his was the guilt which had compassed the first Mrs. Eustace's death. I felt this. I knew him to be cruel. I believed him to be false. And yet I pitied him. Is there a common fund of wickedness in us all? Is the suppression of the development of that wickedness a mere question of training and temptation? And is there something in our deeper sympathies which mutely acknowledges this when we feel for the wicked, when we crowd to a criminal trial, when we shake hands at parting, if we happen to be present officially, with the vilest monster that ever swung on a gallows? It is not for me to decide. I can only say that I pitied Miserrimus Dexter, and that he found it out. "Thank you," he said, suddenly. "You see I am ill, and you feel for me. Dear and good Valeria." "This lady's name, sir, is Mrs. Eustace Macallan," interposed Benjamin, speaking sternly behind him. "The next time you address her, remember, if you please, that you have no business with her Christian name." Benjamin's rebuke passed, like Benjamin's retort, unheeded and unheard. To all appearance, Miserrimus Dexter had completely forgotten that there was such a person in the room. "You have delighted me with the sight of you," he went on. "Add to the pleasure by letting me hear your voice. Talk to me of yourself. Tell me what you have been doing since you left England." It was necessary to my object to set the conversation afloat, and this was as good a way of doing it as any other. I told him plainly how I had been employed during my absence. "So you are still fond of Eustace?" he said, bitterly. "I love him more dearly than ever." He lifted his hand and hid his face. After waiting a while, he went on, speaking in an odd, muffled manner, still under cover of his hands. "And you leave Eustace in Spain," he said. "And you return to England by yourself. What made you do that?" "What made me first come here and ask you to help me, Mr. Dexter?" He dropped his hands and looked at me. I saw in his eyes, not amazement only, but alarm. "Is it possible," he exclaimed, "that you won't let that miserable matter rest even yet? Are you still determined to penetrate the mystery at Gleninch?" "I am still determined, Mr. Dexter, and I still hope that you may be able to help me." The old distrust that I remembered so well darkened again over his face the moment I said those words. "How can I help you?" he asked. "Can I alter facts?" He stopped. His face brightened again, as if some sudden sense of relief had come to him. "I did try to help you," he went on. "I told you that Mrs. Beauly's absence was a device to screen herself from suspicion. I told you that the poison might have been given by Mrs. Beauly's maid. Has reflection convinced you? Do you see something in the idea?" This return to Mrs. Beauly gave me my first chance of leading the talk to the right topic. "I see nothing in the idea," I answered. "I see no motive. Had the maid any reason to be an enemy to the late Mrs. Eustace?"
"Nobody had any reason to be an enemy to the late Mrs. Eustace," he broke out loudly and vehemently. "She was all goodness, all kindness. She never injured any human creature in thought or deed. She was a saint upon earth. Respect her memory. Let the martyr rest in her grave." He covered his face again with his hands, and shook and shuddered under the paroxysm of emotion that I had roused in him. Ariel suddenly and softly left her stool and approached me. "Do you see my 10 claws?" she whispered, holding out her hands. "Vex the master again, and you will feel my 10 claws on your throat." Benjamin rose from his seat. He had seen the action without hearing the words. I signed to him to keep his place. Ariel returned to her stool, and looked up again at her master. "Don't cry," she said. "Come on. Here are the strings. Tease me again. Make me screech with the smarts of it." He never answered, and never moved. Ariel bent her slow mind to meet the difficulty of attracting his attention. I saw it in her frowning brows, and her colorless eyes looking at me vacantly. On a sudden she joyfully struck the open palm of one of her hands with the fist of the other. She had triumphed. She had got an idea. "Master!" she cried. "Master, you haven't told me a story for ever so long. Puzzle my thick head. Make my flesh creep. Come on! A good long story. All blood and crimes." Had she accidentally hit on the right suggestion to strike his wayward fancy? I knew his high opinion of his own skill in dramatic narrative. I knew that one of his favorite amusements was to puzzle Ariel by telling her stories that she could not understand. Would he wander away into the regions of wild romance? Or would he remember that my obstinacy still threatened him with reopening the inquiry into the tragedy at Gleninch? And would he set his cunning at work to mislead me by some new stratagem? This latter course was the course which my past experience of him suggested that he would take. But, to my surprise and alarm, I found my past experience at fault. Ariel succeeded in diverting his mind from the subject which had been in full possession of it the moment before she spoke. He showed his face again. It was overspread by a broad smile of gratified self-esteem. He was weak enough now to let even Ariel find her way to his vanity. I saw it with a sense of misgiving, with a doubt whether I had not delayed my visit until too late, which turned me cold from head to foot. Miserrimus Dexter spoke. To Ariel, not to me. "Poor devil!" he said, patting her head complacently. "You don't understand a word of my stories, do you? And yet I can make the flesh creep on your great clumsy body, and yet I can hold your muddled mind, and make you like it. Poor devil!" He leaned back serenely in his chair, and looked my way again. Would the sight of me remind him of the words that had passed between us not a minute since? No. There was the pleasantly tickled self-conceit smiling at me exactly as it had smiled at Ariel. "I excel in dramatic narrative, Mrs. Valeria," he said. "And this creature here on the stool is a remarkable proof of it. She is quite a psychological study when I tell her one of my stories. It is really amusing to see the half-witted wretch's desperate efforts to understand me. You shall have a specimen. I have been out of spirits while you were away. I haven't told her a story for weeks past. I will tell her one now. Don't suppose it's an effort for me. My invention is inexhaustible. You are sure to be amused. You are naturally serious, but you are sure to be amused. I am naturally serious too, and I always laugh at her." Ariel clapped her great shapeless hands. "He always laughs at me," she said, with a proud look of superiority directed straight at me. I was at a loss, seriously at a loss, what to do. The outbreak which I had provoked in leading him to speak of the late Mrs. Eustace warned me to be careful, and to wait for my opportunity before I reverted to that subject. How else could I turn the conversation so as to lead him, little by little, toward the betrayal of the secrets which he was keeping from me? In this uncertainty, one thing only seemed to be plain. To let him tell his story would be simply to let him waste the precious minutes. With a vivid remembrance of Ariel's 10 claws, I decided nevertheless on discouraging Dexter's new whim at every possible opportunity, and by every means in my power. "Now, Mrs. Valeria," he began, loudly and loftily, "listen. Now, Ariel, bring your brains to a focus. I improvise poetry. I improvise fiction. We will begin with the good old formula of the fairy stories. Once upon a time—" I was waiting for my opportunity to interrupt him when he interrupted himself. He stopped with a bewildered look. He put his hand to his head and passed it backward and forward over his forehead. He laughed feebly. "I seem to want rousing," he said. Was his mind gone? There had been no signs of it until I had unhappily stirred his memory of the dead mistress of Gleninch. Was the weakness which I had already noticed, was the bewilderment which I now saw, attributable to the influence of a passing disturbance only? In other words, had I witnessed nothing more serious than a first warning to him and to us? Would he soon recover himself if he were patient, and gave him time? Even Benjamin was interested at last. I saw him trying to look at Dexter around the corner of the chair. Even Ariel was surprised and uneasy. She had no dark glances to cast at me now. We all waited to see what he would do, to hear what he would say next. "My harp!" he cried. "Music will rouse me." Ariel brought him his harp. "Master," she said, wonderingly, "what's come to you?" He waved his hand, commanding her to be silent. "Ode to Invention," he announced, loftily, addressing himself to me. "Poetry and music improvised by Dexter. Silence! Attention!" His fingers wandered feebly over the harp strings, awakening no melody, suggesting no words. In a little while his hand dropped. His head sank forward gently, and rested on the frame of the harp. I started to my feet and approached him. Was it a sleep, or was it a swoon? I touched his arm and called to him by his name. Ariel instantly stepped between us with a threatening look at me. At the same moment Miserrimus Dexter raised his head. My voice had reached him. He looked at me with a curious contemplative quietness in his eyes which I had never seen in them before. "Take away the harp," he said to Ariel, speaking in languid tones, like a man who was very weary. The mischievous, half-witted creature, in sheer stupidity or in downright malice (I am not sure which), irritated him once more. "Why, master?" she asked, staring at him with the harp hugged in her arms. "What's come to you? Where's the story?" "We don't want the story," I interposed. "I have many things to say to Mr. Dexter which I have not said yet." Ariel lifted her heavy hand. "You will have it," she said, and advanced toward me. At the same moment the master's voice stopped her. "Put away the harp, you fool!" he repeated, sternly. "And wait for the story until I choose to tell it." She took the harp submissively back to its place at the end of the room. Miserrimus Dexter moved his chair a little closer to mine. "I know what will rouse me," he said, confidentially. "Exercise will do. I've had no exercise lately. Wait a little, and you will see." He put his hands on the machinery of the chair, and started on his customary course down the room. Here again the ominous change in him showed itself under a new form. The pace at which he traveled was not the furious pace that I remembered. The chair no longer rushed under him on rumbling and whistling wheels. It went, but it went slowly. Up the room and down the room he painfully urged it, and then he stopped for want of breath. We followed him. Ariel was first, and Benjamin was by my side. He motioned impatiently to both of them to stand back, and to let me approach him alone. "I'm out of practice," he said, faintly. "I hadn't the heart to make the wheels roar and the floor tremble, while you were away." Who would not have pitied him? Who would have remembered his misdeeds at that moment? Even Ariel felt it. I heard her beginning to whine and whimper behind me. The magician who alone could rouse the dormant sensibilities in her nature had awakened them now by his neglect. Her fatal cry was heard again, in mournful, moaning tones. "What's come to you, master? Where's the story?" "Never mind her," I whispered to him. "You want the fresh air. Send for the gardener. Let's take a drive in your pony chaise." It was useless. Ariel would be noticed. The mournful cry came once more. "Where's the story? Where's the story?" The sinking spirit leaped up in Dexter again. "You wretch! You fiend!" he cried, whirling his chair around and facing her. "The story is coming! I can tell it! I will tell it! You whimpering idiot, get me the wine! Why didn't I think of it before? The kingly Burgundy! That's what I want, Valeria, to set my invention alight and flaming in my head. Glasses for everybody! Honor to the king of vintages, the royal Clos Vougeot!" Ariel opened the cupboard in the alcove, and produced the wine and the high Venetian glasses. Dexter drained his goblet full of Burgundy at a draught. He forced us to drink, or at least to pretend to drink, with him. Even Ariel had her share this time, and emptied her glass in rivalry with her master. The powerful wine mounted almost instantly to her weak head. She began to sing hoarsely a song of her own devising, an imitation of Dexter. It was nothing but the repetition, the endless mechanical repetition, of her demand for the story. "Tell us the story, master! Master, tell us the story!" Absorbed over his wine, the master silently filled his goblet for the second time. Benjamin whispered to me while his eye was off us. "Take my advice, Valeria, for once. Let us go." "One last effort," I whispered back. "Only one." Ariel went drowsily on with her song. "Tell us the story, master! Master, tell us the story!" Miserrimus Dexter looked up from his glass. The generous stimulant was beginning to do its work. I saw the color rising in his face. I saw the bright intelligence flashing again in his eyes. The Burgundy had roused him. The good wine stood my friend, and offered me a last chance. "No story," I said. "I want to talk to you, Mr. Dexter. I am not in the humor for a story." "Not in the humor?" he repeated, with a gleam of the old impish irony showing itself again in his face. "That's an excuse. I see what it is. You think my invention is gone, and you are not frank enough to confess it. I'll show you you're wrong. I'll show you that Dexter is himself again. Silence you, Ariel, or you shall leave the room. I've got it, Mrs. Valeria. All laid out here, with scenes and characters complete." He touched his forehead, and looked at me with a furtive and smiling cunning before he added his next words. "It's the very thing to interest you, my fair friend. It's the story of a mistress and a maid. Come back to the fire and hear it." The story of a mistress and a maid! If that meant anything, it meant the story of Mrs. Beauly and her maid, told in disguise. The title, and the look which had escaped him when he announced it, revived the hope that was well nigh dead in me. He had rallied at last. He was again in possession of his natural foresight and his natural cunning. Under pretence of telling Ariel her story, he was evidently about to make the attempt to mislead me for the second time. The conclusion was irresistible. To use his own words, Dexter was himself again. I took Benjamin's arm as we followed him back to the fireplace in the middle of the room. "There is a chance for me yet," I whispered. "Don't forget the signals." We returned to the places which we had already occupied. Ariel cast another threatening look at me. She had just sense enough left, after emptying her goblet of wine, to be on the watch for a new interruption on my part. I took care, of course, that nothing of the sort should happen. I was now as eager as Ariel to hear the story. The subject was full of snares for the narrator. At any moment, in the excitement of speaking, Dexter's memory of the true events might show itself reflected in the circumstances of the fiction. At any moment he might betray himself. He looked around him and began. "My public, are you seated? My public, are you ready?" he asked gayly. "Your face a little more this way," he added, in his softest and tenderest tones, motioning me to turn my full face toward him. "Surely I am not asking too much? You look at the meanest creature that crawls. Look at me. Let me find my inspiration in your eyes. Let me feed my hungry admiration on your form. Come, have one little pitying smile left for the man whose happiness you have wrecked. Thank you, light of my life, thank you." He kissed his hand to me, and threw himself back luxuriously in his chair. "The story," he resumed. "The story at last. In what form shall I cast it? In the dramatic form, the oldest way, the truest way, the shortest way of telling a story. Title first. A short title. A taking title. Mistress and Maid. Scene: the land of romance, Italy. Time: the age of romance, the 15th century. Ha! Look at Ariel! She knows no more about the 15th century than the cat in the kitchen, and yet she is interested already. Happy Ariel!
Ariel looked at me again, in the double intoxication of the wine and the triumph.
I know no more than the cat in the kitchen,
she repeated, with a broad grin of gratified vanity.
I am happy, Ariel. What are you?
Miserrimus Dexter laughed uproariously.
"Didn't I tell you?" he said. "Isn't she fun? Persons of the drama," he resumed, "three in number, women only. Angelica, a noble lady, noble alike in spirit and in birth. Cunegonda, a beautiful devil in woman's form. Damoride, her unfortunate maid. First scene: a dark vaulted chamber in a castle. Time, evening. The owls are hooting in the wood. The frogs are croaking in the marsh. Look at Ariel, her flesh creeps. She shudders audibly. Admirable Ariel!"
My rival in the master's favor eyed me defiantly.
"Admirable Ariel!"
she repeated, in drowsy accents. Miserrimus Dexter paused to take up his goblet of Burgundy, placed close at hand on a little sliding table attached to his chair. I watched him narrowly as he sipped the wine. The flush was still mounting in his face; the light was still brightening in his eyes. He set down his glass again with a jovial smack of his lips, and went on.
"Persons present in the vaulted chamber: Cunegonda and Damoride. Cunegonda speaks. Damoride.
Madame?
Who lies ill in the chamber above us?
Madame, the noble lady Angelica.
A pause. Cunegonda speaks again. Damoride.
Madame?
How does Angelica like you?
Madame, the noble lady, sweet and good to all who approach her, is sweet and good to me.
Have you attended on her, Damoride?
Sometimes, madame, when the nurse was weary.
Has she taken her healing medicine from your hand?
Once or twice, madame, when I happened to be by.
Damoride, take this key and open the casket on the table here. Damoride obeys. Do you see a green vial in the casket?
I see it, madame.
Take it out. Damoride obeys. Do you see a liquid in the green vial? Can you guess what it is?
No, madame.
Shall I tell you? Damoride bows respectfully. Poison is in the vial. Damoride starts. She shrinks from the poison. She would fain put it aside. Her mistress signs to her to keep it in her hand. Her mistress speaks. Damoride, I have told you one of my secrets. Shall I tell you another? Damoride waits, fearing what is to come. Her mistress speaks. I hate the Lady Angelica. Her life stands between me and the joy of my heart. You hold her life in your hand. Damoride drops on her knees. She is a devout person. She crosses herself, and then she speaks.
Mistress, you terrify me. Mistress, what do I hear?
Cunegonda advances, stands over her, looks down on her with terrible eyes, whispers the next words. Damoride, the Lady Angelica must die, and I must not be suspected. The Lady Angelica must die, and by your hand."
He paused again, to sip the wine once more, no, to drink a deep draught of it this time. Was the stimulant beginning to fail him already? I looked at him attentively as he laid himself back again in his chair to consider for a moment before he went on. The flush on his face was as deep as ever, but the brightness in his eyes was beginning to fade already. I had noticed that he spoke more and more slowly as he advanced to the later dialogue of the scene. Was he feeling the effort of invention already?
Had the time come when the wine had done all that the wine could do for him? We waited. Ariel sat watching him with vacantly staring eyes and vacantly open mouth. Benjamin, impenetrably expecting the signal, kept his open note-book on his knee, covered by his hand. Miserrimus Dexter went on. Damoride hears those terrible words. Damoride clasps her hands in entreaty. "Oh, madame, madame, how can I kill the dear and noble lady? What motive have I for harming her?" Cunegonde answers. "You have the motive of obeying me." Damoride falls with her face on the floor at her mistress's feet. "Madame, I cannot do it. Madame, I dare not do it." Cunegonde answers. "You run no risk. I have my plan for diverting discovery from myself, and my plan for diverting discovery from you." Damoride repeats. "I cannot do it. I dare not do it." Cunegonde's eyes flash lightnings of rage. She takes from its place of concealment in her bosom. He stopped in the middle of the sentence and put his hand to his head, not like a man in pain, but like a man who had lost his idea. Would it be well if I tried to help him to recover his idea? Or would it be wiser if I could only do it to keep silence? I could see the drift of his story plainly enough. His object, under the thin disguise of the Italian romance, was to meet my unanswerable objection to suspecting Mrs. Beauly's maid, the objection that the woman had no motive for committing herself to an act of murder. If he could practically contradict this by discovering a motive which I should be obliged to admit, his end would be gained. Those inquiries which I had pledged myself to pursue, those inquiries which might, at any moment, take a turn that directly concerned him, would, in that case, be successfully diverted from the right to the wrong person. The innocent maid would set my strictest scrutiny at defiance, and Dexter would be safely shielded behind her. I determined to give him time. Not a word passed my lips. The minutes followed each other. I waited in the deepest anxiety. It was a trying and a critical moment. If he succeeded in inventing a probable motive, and in shaping it neatly to suit the purpose of his story, he would prove, by that act alone, that there were reserves of mental power still left in him which the practiced eye of the Scotch doctor had failed to see. But the question was, would he do it? He did it. Not in a new way, not in a convincing way, not without a painfully evident effort. Still, well done or ill done, he found a motive for the maid. "Cunegonde," he resumed, "takes from its place of concealment in her bosom a written paper, and unfolds it. 'Look at this,' she says. Damoride looks at the paper, and sinks again at her mistress's feet in a paroxysm of horror and despair. Cunegonde is in possession of a shameful secret in the maid's past life. Cunegonde can say to her, Choose your alternative. Either submit to an exposure which disgraces you, and disgraces your parents forever, or make up your mind to obey me. Damoride might submit to the disgrace if it only affected herself. But her parents are honest people. She cannot disgrace her parents. She is driven to her last refuge. There is no hope of melting the hard heart of Cunegonde. Her only resource is to raise difficulties. She tries to show that there are obstacles between her and the crime. 'Madame, madame!' she cries, 'how can I do it, when the nurse is there to see me?' Cunegonde answers, 'Sometimes the nurse sleeps. Sometimes the nurse is away.' Damoride still persists. 'Madame, madame! The door is kept locked, and the nurse has got the key.' The key! I instantly thought of the missing key at Gleninch. Had he thought of it too? He certainly checked himself as the word escaped him. I resolved to make the signal. I rested my elbow on the arm of my chair, and played with my earring. Benjamin took out his pencil and arranged his note-book so that Ariel could not see what he was about if she happened to look his way. We waited until it pleased Miserrimus Dexter to proceed. The interval was a long one. His hand went up again to his forehead. A duller and duller look was palpably stealing over his eyes. When he did speak, it was not to go on with the narrative, but to put a question. "Where did I leave off?" he asked. My hopes sank again as rapidly as they had risen. I managed to answer him, however, without showing any change in my manner. "You left off," I said, "where Damoride was speaking to Cunegonda." "Yes, yes," he interposed. "And what did she say?" "She said, 'The door is kept locked, and the nurse has got the key.'" He instantly leaned forward in his chair. "No!" he answered, vehemently. "You're wrong. Key? Nonsense! I never said key." "I thought you did, Mr. Dexter." "I never did. I said something else, and you have forgotten it." I refrained from disputing with him, in fear of what might follow. We waited again. Benjamin, sullenly submitting to my caprices, had taken down the questions and answers that had passed between Dexter and myself. He still mechanically kept his page open, and still held his pencil in readiness to go on. Ariel, quietly submitting to the drowsy influence of the wine while Dexter's voice was in her ears, felt uneasily the change to silence. She glanced round her restlessly; she lifted her eyes to the Master. There he sat, silent, with his hand to his head, still struggling to marshal his wandering thoughts, still trying to see light through the darkness that was closing round him. "Master!" cried Ariel, piteously, "what's become of the story?" He started as if she had wakened him out of his sleep. He shook his head impatiently, as though he wanted to throw off some oppression that weighed upon it. "Patience, patience!" he said. "The story is going on again." He dashed at it desperately. He picked up the first lost thread that fell in his way, reckless whether it were the right thread or the wrong one. "Damoride fell on her knees. She burst into tears. She said—" He stopped and looked about him with vacant eyes. "What name did I give the other woman?" he asked, not putting the question to me, or to either of my companions, asking it of himself, and asking it of the empty air. "You called the other woman Cunegonda," I said. At the sound of my voice his eyes turned slowly, turned on me, and yet failed to look at me. Dull and absent, still and changeless, they were eyes that seemed to be fixed on something far away. Even his voice was altered when he spoke next. It had dropped to a quiet, vacant, monotonous tone. I had heard something like it while I was watching by my husband's bedside, at the time of his delirium, when Eustace's mind appeared to be too weary to follow his speech. Was the end so near as this? "I called her Cunegonda," he repeated. "And I called the other—" He stopped once more. "And you called the other Damoride," I said. Ariel looked up at him with a broad stare of bewilderment. She pulled impatiently at the sleeve of his jacket to attract his attention. "Is this the story, Master?" she asked. He answered without looking at her, his changeless eyes still fixed, as it seemed, on something far away. "This is the story," he said, absently. "But why Cunegonda? Why Damoride? Why not mistress and maid? It's easier to remember mistress and maid." He hesitated. He shivered as he tried to raise himself in his chair. Then he seemed to rally. "What did the maid say to the mistress?" he muttered. What?" He hesitated again. Then something seemed to dawn upon him unexpectedly. Was it some new thought that had struck him? Or some lost thought that he had recovered? Impossible to say. He went on, suddenly and rapidly went on, in these strange words. "The letter, the maid said. The letter! Oh, my heart, every word a dagger in my heart! Oh, you letter! Horrible, horrible, horrible letter!" What in God's name was he talking about? What did those words mean? Was he unconsciously pursuing his faint and fragmentary recollections of a past time at Gleninch, under the delusion that he was going on with the story? In the wreck of the other faculties, was memory the last to sink? Was the truth, the dreadful truth, glimmering on me dimly through the awful shadows cast before it by the advancing eclipse of the brain? My breath failed me, a nameless horror crept through my whole being. Benjamin, with his pencil in his hand, cast one warning look at me. Ariel was quiet and satisfied. "Go on, Master," was all she said. "I like it, I like it. Go on with the story." He went on, like a man sleeping with his eyes open, and talking in his sleep. "The maid said to the mistress, no. The mistress said to the maid. The mistress said, 'Show him the letter. Must do it.' The maid said, 'No, mustn't do it. Shan't show it. Stuff. Nonsense! Let him suffer. What can get him off? Show it? No. Let the worst come to the worst. Show it then. The mistress said—" He paused, and waved his hand rapidly to and fro before his eyes, as if he were brushing away some visionary confusion or entanglement. "Which was it last?" he said. "Mistress or maid? Mistress. No. Maid speaks, of course. Loud, positive. You scoundrels, keep away from that table. The diary's there. Number 9, Caldershaws. Ask for Dandy. You shan't have the diary. A secret in your ear. The diary will hang him. I won't have him hanged. How dare you touch my chair? My chair's me. How dare you touch me?" The last words burst on me like a gleam of light. I had read them in the report of the trial, in the evidence of the sheriff's officer. Miserrimus Dexter had spoken in those very terms when he had tried vainly to prevent the men from seizing my husband's papers, and when the men had pushed his chair out of the room. There was no doubt now of what his memory was busy with. The mystery at Gleninch. His last backward flight of thought circled feebly and more feebly, nearer and nearer to the mystery at Gleninch. Ariel aroused him again. She had no mercy on him. She insisted on hearing the whole story. "Why do you stop, master? Get along with it! Get along with it! Tell us quick! What did the missus say to the maid?" He laughed feebly, and tried to imitate her. "What did the missus say to the maid?" he repeated. His laugh died away. He went on speaking more and more vacantly, more and more rapidly. "The mistress said to the maid, 'We've got him off. What about the letter? Burn it now. No fire in the grate. No matches in the box. House topsy-turvy. Servants all gone. Tear it up. Shake it up in the basket, along with the rest. Shake it up. Waste paper. Throw it away. Gone forever. Oh, Sarah, Sarah, Sarah! Gone forever!'" Ariel clapped her hands, and mimicked him in her turn. "Oh, Sarah, Sarah, Sarah!" she repeated. "Gone forever! That's prime, master! Tell us, who was Sarah?" His lips moved, but his voice sank so low that I could barely hear him. He began again with the old melancholy refrain. "The maid said to the mistress no, the mistress said to the maid—" He stopped abruptly, and raised himself erect in the chair. He threw up both his hands above his head, and burst into a frightful screaming laugh. "Funny! Why don't you laugh? Funny, 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 funny! Ha, ha!" He fell back in the chair. The shrill and dreadful laugh died away into a low sob. Then there was one long, deep, wearily drawn breath. Then nothing but a mute, vacant face, turned up to the ceiling, with eyes that looked blindly, with lips parted in a senseless, changeless grin. Nemesis at last! The foretold doom had fallen on him. The night had come. But one feeling animated me when the first shock was over. Even the horror of that fearful sight seemed only to increase the pity that I felt for the stricken wretch. I started impulsively to my feet. Seeing nothing, thinking of nothing but the helpless figure in the chair, I sprang forward to raise him, to revive him, to recall him, if such a thing might still be possible, to himself. At the first step that I took, I felt hands on me. I was violently drawn back. "Are you blind?" cried Benjamin, dragging me nearer and nearer to the door. "Look there!" He pointed, and I looked. Ariel had been beforehand with me. She had raised her master in the chair. She had got one arm around him. In her free hand she brandished an Indian club, torn from a trophy of Oriental weapons that ornamented the wall over the fireplace. The creature was transfigured. Her dull eyes glared like the eyes of a wild animal. She gnashed her teeth in the frenzy that possessed her. "You have done this!" she shouted to me, waving the club furiously around and around over her head. "Come near him, and I'll dash your brains out! I'll smash you till there's not a whole bone left in your skin!" Benjamin, still holding me with one hand, opened the door with the other. I let him do with me as he would. Ariel fascinated me. I could look at nothing but Ariel. Her frenzy vanished as she saw us retreating. She dropped the club. She threw both arms around him, and nestled her head on his bosom, and sobbed and wept over him. Master, master, they shan't vex you any more. Look up again. Laugh at me as you used to do. Say, Ariel, you're a fool. Be like yourself again." I was forced into the next room. I heard a long, low, wailing cry of misery from the poor creature who loved him with a dog's fidelity and a woman's devotion. The heavy door was closed between us. I was in the quiet antechamber, crying over that piteous sight, clinging to my kind of old friend, as helpless and as useless as a child. Benjamin turned the key in the lock. "There's no use in crying about it," he said quietly. "It would be more to the purpose, Valeria, if you thanked God that you have got out of that room safe and sound. Come with me." He took the key out of the lock, and led me downstairs into the hall. After a little consideration, he opened the front door of the house. The gardener was still quietly at work in the grounds. "Your master is taken ill," Benjamin said, "and the woman who attends upon him has lost her head, if she ever had a head to lose. Where does the nearest doctor live?" The man's devotion to Dexter showed itself, as a woman's devotion had shown itself, in the man's rough way. He threw down his spade with an oath. "The master taken bad," he said. "I'll fetch the doctor. I shall find him sooner than you will." "Tell the doctor to bring a man with him," Benjamin added. "He may want help." The gardener turned around sternly. "I'm the man," he said. "Nobody shall help but me." He left us. I sat down on one of the chairs in the hall, and did my best to compose myself. Benjamin walked to and fro, deep in thought. "Both of them fond of him," I heard my old friend say to himself. "Half monkey, half man, and both of them fond of him. That beats me." The gardener returned with the doctor, a quiet, dark, resolute man. Benjamin advanced to meet them. "I have got the key," he said. "Shall I go upstairs with you?" Without answering, the doctor drew Benjamin aside into a corner of the hall. The two talked together in low voices. At the end of it the doctor said, "Give me the key. You can be of no use. You will only irritate her." With those words he beckoned to the gardener. He was about to lead the way up the stairs when I ventured to stop him. "May I stay in the hall, sir?" I said. "I am very anxious to hear how it ends." He looked at me for a moment before he replied. "You had better go home, madam," he said. "Is the gardener acquainted with your address?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. I will let you know how it ends by means of the gardener. Take my advice. Go home." Benjamin placed my arm in his. I looked back, and saw the doctor and the gardener ascending the stairs together on their way to the locked up room. "Never mind the doctor," I whispered. "Let's wait in the garden." Benjamin would not hear of deceiving the doctor. "I mean to take you home," he said. I looked at him in amazement. My old friend, who was all meekness and submission so long as there was no emergency to try him, now showed the dormant reserve of manly spirit and decision in his nature as he had never, in my experience, shown it yet. He led me into the garden. We had kept our cab; it was waiting for us at the gate. On our way home Benjamin produced his notebook. "What's to be done, my dear, with the gibberish that I have written here?" he said. "Have you written it all down?" I asked, in surprise. "When I undertake a duty, I do it," he answered. "You never gave me the signal to leave off. You never moved your chair. I have written every word of it. What shall I do? Throw it out the cab window?" "Give it to me." "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet. I will ask Mr. Playmore." End of Chapter 40.
One of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 41. Mr. Playmore in a New Character. By that night's post, although I was far from being fit to make the exertion, I wrote to Mr. Playmore to tell him what had taken place, and to beg for his earliest assistance and advice. The notes in Benjamin's book were partly written in shorthand, and were, on that account, of no use to me in their existing condition. At my request, he made 2 fair copies. One of the copies I enclosed in my letter to Mr. Playmore. The other I laid by me, on my bedside table, when I went to rest. Over and over again, through the long hours of the wakeful night, I read and re read the last words which had dropped from Miserrimus Dexter's lips. Was it possible to interpret them to any useful purpose? At the very outset they seemed to set interpretation at defiance. After trying vainly to solve the hopeless problem, I did at last what I might as well have done at first I threw down the paper in despair. Where were my bright visions of discovery and success now? Scattered to the winds. Was there the faintest chance of the stricken man's return to reason? I remembered too well what I had seen to hope for it. The closing lines of the medical report which I had read in Mr. Playmore's office recurred to my memory in the stillness of the night. When the catastrophe has happened, his friends can entertain no hope of his cure. The balance once lost will be lost for life. The confirmation of that terrible sentence was not long in reaching me. On the next morning the gardener brought a note, containing the information which the doctor had promised to give me on the previous day. Miserrimus Dexter and Ariel were still where Benjamin and I had left them together, in the long room. They were watched by skilled attendants, waiting the decision of Dexter's nearest relative, a younger brother who lived in the country, and who had been communicated with by telegraph. It had been found impossible to part the faithful Ariel from her master without using the bodily restraints adopted in cases of raging insanity. The doctor and the gardener, both unusually strong men, had failed to hold the poor creature when they first attempted to remove her on entering the room. Directly they permitted her to return to her master, the frenzy vanished. She was perfectly quiet and contented so long as they let her sit at his feet and look at him. Sad as this was, the report of Miserrimus Dexter's condition was more melancholy still. "My patient is in a state of absolute imbecility." Those were the words in the doctor's letter, and the gardener's simple narrative confirmed them as the truest words that could have been used. He was utterly unconscious of poor Ariel's devotion to him. He did not even appear to know that she was present in the room. For hours together he remained in a state of utter lethargy in his chair. He showed an animal interest in his meals, and a greedy animal enjoyment of eating and drinking as much as he could get, and that was all. "This morning," the honest gardener said to me at parting, "we thought he seemed to wake up a bit. Looked about him, you know, and made queer signs with his hands. I couldn't make out what he meant, no more could the doctor. She knew, poor thing, she did. Went and got him his harp, and put his hand up to it. Lord bless you, no use. He couldn't play no more than I can. Twanged at it anyhow, and grinned and gabbled to himself. No, he'll never come right again. Any person can see that, without the doctor to help him. Enjoys his meals, as I told you, and that's all. It would be the best thing that could happen if it would please God to take him. There's no more to be said. I wish you good morning, ma'am." He went away with the tears in his eyes, and he left me, I own it, with the tears in mine. An hour later there came some news which revived me. I received a telegram from Mr. Playmore, expressed in these welcome words: "Obliged to go to London by to-night's mail train. Expect me to breakfast to-morrow morning." The appearance of the lawyer at our breakfast table duly followed the appearance of his telegram. His first words cheered me up. To my infinite surprise and relief, he was far from sharing the despondent view which I took of my position. "I don't deny," he said, "that there are some serious obstacles in your way. But I should never have called here before attending to my professional business in London, if Mr. Benjamin's notes had not produced a very strong impression on my mind. For the first time, as I think, you really have a prospect of success. For the first time, I feel justified in offering, under certain restrictions, to help you. That miserable wretch, in the collapse of his intelligence, has done what he would never have done in the possession of his sense and his cunning. He has let us see the first precious glimmerings of the light of truth." "Are you sure it is the truth?" I asked. "In two important particulars," he answered, "I know it to be the truth. Your idea about him is the right one. His memory, as you suppose, was the least injured of his faculties, and was the last to give way under the strain of trying to tell that story. I believe his memory to have been speaking to you, unconsciously to himself, in all that he said from the moment when the first reference to 'the letter' escaped him to the end." "But what does the reference to the letter mean?" I asked. "For my part, I am entirely in the dark about it." "So am I," he answered frankly. The chief one amongst the obstacles which I mentioned just now is the obstacle presented by that same letter. The late Mrs. Eustace must have been connected with it in some way, or Dexter would never have spoken of it as a dagger in his heart. Dexter would never have coupled her name with the words which describe the tearing up of the letter and the throwing of it away. I can arrive with some certainty at this result, and I can get no further. I have no more idea than you have of who wrote the letter, or of what was written in it. If we are ever to make that discovery, probably the most important discovery of all, we must dispatch our first inquiries a distance of 3,000 miles. In plain English, my dear lady, we must send to America." This, naturally enough, took me completely by surprise. I waited eagerly to hear why we were to send to America. "It rests with you," he proceeded, "when you hear what I have to tell you, to say whether you will go to the expense of sending a man to New York or not. I can find the right man for the purpose; and I estimate the expense, including a telegram—" "Never mind the expense," I interposed, losing all patience with the eminently Scotch view of the case, which put my purse in the first place of importance. "I don't care for the expense; I want to know what you have discovered." He smiled. "She doesn't care for the expense," he said to himself, pleasantly. "How like a woman!" I might have retorted, "He thinks of the expense before he thinks of anything else. How like a Scotchman!" As it was, I was too anxious to be witty. I only drummed impatiently with my fingers on the table, and said, "Tell me! Tell me!" He took out the fair copy from Benjamin's note book which I had sent to him, and showed me these among Dexter's closing words: "What about the letter? Burn it now. No fire in the grate. No matches in the box. House topsy-turvy. Servants all gone." "Do you really understand what those words mean?" I asked. "I look back into my own experience," he answered; "and I understand perfectly what the words mean." "And can you make me understand them too?" "Easily. In those incomprehensible sentences, Dexter's memory has correctly recalled certain facts. I have only to tell you the facts, and you will be as wise as I am. At the time of the trial, your husband surprised and distressed me by insisting on the instant dismissal of all the household servants at Gleninch. I was instructed to pay them a quarter's wages in advance, to give them the excellent written characters which their good conduct thoroughly deserved, and to see the house clear of them at an hour's notice. Eustace's motive for this summary proceeding was much the same motive which animated his conduct toward you. 'If I am ever to return to Gleninch,' he said, 'I cannot face my honest servants after the infamy of having stood my trial for murder.' There was his reason. Nothing that I could say to him, poor fellow, shook his resolution. I dismissed the servants accordingly. At an hour's notice they quitted the house, leaving their work for the day all undone. The only persons placed in charge of Gleninch were persons who lived on the outskirts of the park, that is to say, the lodge keeper and his wife and daughter. On the last day of the trial, I instructed the daughter to do her best to make the rooms tidy. She was a good girl enough, but she had no experience as a housemaid. It would never enter her head to lay the bedroom fires ready for lighting, or to replenish the empty match boxes. Those chance words that dropped from Dexter would, no doubt, exactly describe the state of his room when he returned to Gleninch with the prisoner and his mother from Edinburgh. That he tore up the mysterious letter in his bedroom, and, finding no means immediately at hand for burning it, that he threw the fragment into the empty grate or into the waste paper basket, seems to be the most reasonable conclusion that we can draw from what we know. In any case, he would not have much time to think about it. Everything was done in a hurry on that day. Eustace and his mother, accompanied by Dexter, left for England the same evening by the night train. I myself locked up the house, and gave the keys to the lodge keeper. It was understood that he was to look after the preservation of the reception rooms on the ground floor, and that his wife and daughter were to perform the same service between them in the rooms upstairs. On receiving your letter, I drove at once to Gleninch to question the old woman on the subject of the bedrooms, and of Dexter's room especially. She remembered the time when the house was shut up, by associating it with the time when she was confined to her bed by an attack of sciatica. She had not crossed the lodge door, she was sure, for at least a week, if not longer, after Gleninch had been left in charge of her husband and herself. Whatever was done in the way of keeping the bedrooms aired and tidy during her illness was done by her daughter. She, and she only, must have disposed of any letter which might have been lying about in Dexter's room. Not a vestige of torn paper, as I can myself certify, is to be discovered in any part of the room now. Where did the girl find the fragments of the letter, and what did she do with them? Those are the questions, if you approve of it, which we must send 3,000 miles away to ask, for this sufficient reason, that the lodge keeper's daughter was married more than a year since, and that she is settled with her husband in business at New York. It rests with you to decide what is to be done. Don't let me mislead you with false hopes. Don't let me tempt you to throw away your money. Even if this woman does remember what she did with the torn paper, the chances, at this distance of time, are enormously against our ever recovering a single morsel of it. Be in no haste to decide. I have my work to do in the city. I can give you the whole day to think it over." "Send the men to New York by the next steamer," I said. "There is my decision, Mr. Playmore, without keeping you waiting for it." He shook his head in grave disapproval of my impetuosity. In my former interview with him we had never once touched on the question of money. I was now, for the first time, to make acquaintance with Mr. Playmore on the purely Scotch side of his character. "Why, you don't even know what it will cost you!" he exclaimed, taking out his pocket book with the air of a man who was equally startled and scandalized. "Wait till I tot it up," he said, "in English and American money." "I can't wait! I want to make more discoveries." He took no notice of my interruption. He went on impenetrably with his calculations. "The man will go second class, and will take a return ticket. Very well, his ticket includes his food, and, being thank God a teetotaler, he won't waste your money in buying liquor on board. Arrived at New York, he will go to a cheap German house, where he will, as I am credibly informed, be boarded and lodged at the rate—" By this time, my patience being completely worn out, I had taken my cheque book from the table drawer, had signed my name, and had handed the blank cheque across the table to my legal adviser. "Fill it in with whatever the man wants," I said; "and for Heaven's sake let's get back to Dexter." Mr. Playmore fell back in his chair, and lifted his hands and eyes to the ceiling. I was not in the least impressed by that solemn appeal to the unseen powers of arithmetic and money. I insisted positively on being fed with more information. "Listen to this," I went on, reading from Benjamin's notes. "What did Dexter mean when he said, 'Number 9, Caldershaws. Ask for Dandy'? You shan't have the Diary. A secret in your ear. The Diary will hang him. How came Dexter to know what was in my husband's Diary? And what does he mean by Number 9, Caldershaws, and the rest of it? Facts again?" "Facts again," Mr. Playmore answered. "Muddled up together, as you may say; but positive facts for all that. Caldershaws, you must know, is one of the most disreputable districts in Edinburgh. One of my clerks, whom I am in the habit of employing confidentially, volunteered to inquire for Dandy at Number 9. It was a ticklish business in every way, and my man wisely took a person with him who was known in the neighbourhood. Number 9 turned out to be, ostensibly, a shop for the sale of rags and old iron; and Dandy was suspected of trading now and then additionally as a receiver of stolen goods. Thanks to the influence of his companion, backed by a bank note (which can be repaid, by the way, out of the fund for the American expenses), my clerk succeeded in making the fellow speak. Not to trouble you with needless details, the result in substance was this. A fortnight or more before the date of Mrs. Eustace's death, Dandy made 2 keys from wax models supplied to him by a new customer. The mystery observed in the matter by the agent who managed it excited Dandy's distrust. He had the man privately watched before he delivered the keys, and he ended in discovering that his customer was Miserrimus Dexter. Wait a little, I have not done yet. Add to this information Dexter's incomprehensible knowledge of the contents of your husband's Diary, and the product is, that the wax models sent to the old iron shop in Caldershaws were models taken by theft from the key of the Diary and the key of the table drawer in which it was kept. I have my own idea of the revelations that are still to come, if this matter is properly followed up. Never mind going into that at present. Dexter, I tell you again, is answerable for the late Mrs. Eustace's death. How he is answerable, I believe you are in a fair way of finding out. And more than that, I say now what I could not venture to say before. It is a duty toward justice, as well as a duty toward your husband, to bring the truth to light. As for the difficulties to be encountered, I don't think they need daunt you. The greatest difficulties give way in the end, when they are attacked by the united alliance of patient resolution and economy." With a strong emphasis on the last words, my worthy adviser, mindful of the flight of time and the claims of business, rose to take his leave. "One word more," I said, as he held out his hand. "Can you manage to see Miserrimus Dexter before you go back to Edinburgh? From what the gardener told me, his brother must be with him by this time. It would be a relief to me to hear the latest news of him, and to hear it from you." "It is part of my business in London to see him," said Mr. Playmore. "But mind, I have no hope of his recovery. I only wish to satisfy myself that his brother is able and willing to take care of him. So far as we are concerned, Mrs. Eustace, this unhappy man has said his last words." He opened the door, stopped, considered, and came back to me. "With regard to that matter of sending the agent to America," he resumed, "I propose to have the honor of submitting to you a brief abstract—" "Oh, Mr. Playmore!" "A brief abstract in writing, Mrs. Eustace, of the estimated expenses of the whole proceeding. You will be good enough maturely to consider the same, making any remarks on it, tending to economy, which may suggest themselves to your mind at the time. And you will further oblige me, if you approve of the abstract, by yourself filling in the blank space on your cheque with the needful amount in words and figures. No, madam! I really cannot justify it to my conscience to carry about my person any such loose and reckless document as a blank cheque. There is a total disregard for the first claims of prudence and economy implied in this small slip of paper, which is nothing less than a flat contradiction of the principles that have governed my whole life. I can't submit to flat contradiction. Good morning, Mrs. Eustace. Good morning." He laid my cheque on the table with a low bow, and left me. Among the curious developments of human stupidity which occasionally present themselves to view, surely the least excusable is the stupidity which, to this day, persists in wondering why the Scotch succeed so well in life. Chapter 41. Of the Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 42. More Surprises. The same evening I received my abstract by the hands of a clerk. It was an intensely characteristic document. My expenses were remorselessly calculated downward to shillings, and even to pence; and our unfortunate messenger's instructions in respect to his expenditure were reduced to a nicety which must have made his life in America nothing less than a burden to him. In mercy to the man, I took the liberty, when I wrote back to Mr. Playmore, of slightly increasing the indicated amount of the figures which were to appear on the cheque. I ought to have better known the correspondent whom I had to deal with. Mr. Playmore's reply, informing me that our emissary had started on his voyage, returned a receipt in due form, and the whole of the surplus money to the last farthing. A few hurried lines accompanied the abstract, and stated the result of the lawyer's visit to Miserrimus Dexter. There was no change for the better; there was no change at all. Mr. Dexter, the brother, had arrived at the house accompanied by a medical man accustomed to the charge of the insane. The new doctor declined to give any definite opinion on the case until he had studied it carefully with plenty of time at his disposal. It had been accordingly arranged that he should remove Miserrimus Dexter to the asylum of which he was the proprietor, as soon as the preparations for receiving the patient could be completed. The one difficulty that still remained to be met related to the disposal of the faithful creature who had never left her master night or day since the catastrophe had happened. Ariel had no friends and no money. The proprietor of the asylum could not be expected to receive her without the customary payment, and Mr. Dexter's brother regretted to say that he was not rich enough to find the money. A forcible separation from the one human being whom she loved, and a removal in the character of a pauper to a public asylum such was the prospect which awaited the unfortunate creature, unless some one interfered in her favor before the end of the week. Under these sad circumstances, good Mr. Playmore, passing over the claims of economy in favour of the claims of humanity, suggested that we should privately start a subscription, and offered to head the list liberally himself. I must have written all these pages to very little purpose, if it is necessary for me to add that I instantly sent a letter to Mr. Dexter, the brother, undertaking to be answerable for whatever money was to be required while the subscriptions were being collected, and only stipulating that when Miserrimus Dexter was removed to the asylum, Ariel should accompany him. This was readily conceded; but serious objections were raised when I further requested that she might be permitted to attend on her master in the asylum as she had attended on him in the house. The rules of the establishment forbade it, and the universal practice in such cases forbade it, and so on, and so on. However, by dint of perseverance and persuasion, I so far carried my point as to gain a reasonable concession. During certain hours in the day, and under certain wise restrictions, Ariel was to be allowed the privilege of waiting on her master in his room, as well as of accompanying him when he was brought out in his chair to take the air in the garden. For the honour of humanity, let me add that the liability which I had undertaken made no very serious demands on my resources. Placed in Benjamin's charge, our subscription list prospered. Friends, and even strangers sometimes, opened their hearts and their purses when they heard Ariel's melancholy story. The day which followed the day of Mr. Playmore's visit brought me news from Spain, in a letter from my mother-in-law. To describe what I felt when I broke the seal and read the first lines is simply impossible. Let Mrs. Macallan be heard on this occasion in my place. Thus she wrote: "Prepare yourself, my dearest Valeria, for a delightful surprise. Eustace has justified my confidence in him. When he returns to England, he returns, if you will let him, to his wife. This resolution, let me hasten to assure you, has not been brought about by any persuasions of mine. It is the natural outgrowth of your husband's gratitude and your husband's love. The first words he said to me, when he was able to speak, were these: 'If I live to return to England, and if I go to Valeria, do you think she will forgive me?' We can only leave it to you, my dear, to give the answer. If you love us, answer us by return of post. Having now told you what he said when I first informed him that you had been his nurse, and remember, if it seems very little, that he is still too weak to speak except with difficulty, I shall purposely keep my letter back for a few days. My object is to give him time to think, and to frankly tell you of it if the interval produces any change in his resolution. 3 days have passed, and there is no change. He has but one feeling now he longs for the day which is to unite him again to his wife. But there is something else connected with Eustace that you ought to know, and that I ought to tell you. Greatly as time and suffering have altered him in many respects, there is no change, Valeria, in the aversion, the horror I may even say, with which he views your idea of inquiring anew into the circumstances which attended the lamentable death of his first wife. It makes no difference to him that you are only animated by a desire to serve his interests. Has she given up that idea? Are you positively sure she has given up that idea? Over and over again he has put these questions to me. I have answered what else could I do in the miserable feeble state in which he still lies? I have answered in such a manner as to soothe and satisfy him. I have said, relieve your mind of all anxiety on that subject. Valeria has no choice but to give up the idea. The obstacles in her way have proven to be insurmountable. The obstacles have conquered her. This, if you remember, was what I really believed would happen when you and I spoke of that painful topic; and I have heard nothing from you since which has tended to shake my opinion in the smallest degree. If I am right, as I pray God I may be, in the view that I take, you have only to confirm me in your reply, and all will be well. In the other event, that is to say, if you are still determined to persevere in your hopeless project, then make up your mind to face the result. Set Eustace's prejudices at defiance in this particular, and you lose your hold on his gratitude, his penitence, and his love. You will, in my belief, never see him again. I express myself strongly, in your own interests, my dear, and for your own sake. When you reply, write a few lines to Eustace, enclosed in your letter to me. As for the date of our departure, it is still impossible for me to give you any definite information. Eustace recovers very slowly, the doctor has not yet allowed him to leave his bed, and when we do travel we must journey by easy stages. It will be at least 6 weeks, at the earliest, before we can hope to be back again in dear old England. Affectionately yours, "Catherine Macallan." I laid down the letter, and did my best, vainly enough for some time, to compose my spirits. To understand the position in which I now found myself, it is only necessary to remember one circumstance. The messenger to whom we had committed our inquiries was at that moment crossing the Atlantic on his way to New York. What was to be done? I hesitated. Shocking as it may seem to some people, I hesitated. There was really no need to hurry my decision. I had the whole day before me. I went out and took a wretched, lonely walk, and turned the matter over in my mind. I came home again, and turned the matter over once more by the fireside. To offend and repel my darling, when he was returning to me, penitently returning of his own free will, was what no woman in my position, and feeling as I did, could under any earthly circumstances have brought herself to do. And yet, on the other hand, how in Heaven's name could I give up my grand enterprise at the very time when even wise and prudent Mr. Playmore saw such a prospect of succeeding in it that he had actually volunteered to help me? Placed between those two cruel alternatives, which could I choose? Think of your own frailties, and have some mercy on mine. I turned my back on both the alternatives. Those two agreeable fiends, prevarication and deceit, took me, as it were, softly by the hand. "Don't commit yourself either way, my dear," they said, in their most persuasive manner. "Write just enough to compose your mother-in-law, and to satisfy your husband. You've got time before you. Wait and see if time doesn't stand your friend, and get you out of the difficulty." Infamous advice! And yet I took it, I who had been well brought up, and who ought to have known better. You who read the shameful confession would have known better, I am sure. You are not included in the prayer book category among the "miserable sinners." Well, well, let me have virtue enough to tell the truth. In writing to my mother-in-law, I informed her that it had been found necessary to remove Miserrimus Dexter to an asylum, and I left her to draw her own conclusions from that fact, unenlightened by so much as one word of additional information. In the same way, I told my husband a part of the truth, and no more. I said I forgave him with all my heart and I did. I said he had only to come to me, and I would receive him with open arms and so I would. As for the rest, let me say with Hamlet, "The rest is silence." Having dispatched my unworthy letters, I found myself growing restless, and feeling the want of a change. It would be necessary to wait at least 8 or 9 days before we could hope to hear by telegraph from New York. I bade farewell for a time to my dear and admirable Benjamin, and betook myself to my old home in the North, at the vicarage of my uncle Starkweather. My journey to Spain to nurse Eustace had made my peace with my worthy relatives. We had exchanged friendly letters, and I had promised to be their guest as soon as it was possible for me to leave London. I passed a quiet and, all things considered, a happy time among the old scenes. I visited once more the bank by the river side where Eustace and I had first met. I walked again on the lawn, and loitered through the shrubbery, those favourite haunts in which we had so often talked over our troubles, and so often forgotten them in a kiss. How sadly and strangely had our lives been parted since that time! How uncertain still was the fortune which the future had in store for us! The associations amid which I was now living had their softening effect on my heart, their elevating influence over my mind. I reproached myself, bitterly reproached myself, for not having written more fully and frankly to Eustace. Why had I hesitated to sacrifice to him my hopes and my interests in the coming investigation? He had not hesitated, poor fellow! His first thought was the thought of his wife. I had passed a fortnight with my uncle and aunt before I heard again from Mr. Playmore. When a letter from him arrived at last, it disappointed me indescribably. A telegram from our messenger informed us that the lodge keeper's daughter and her husband had left New York, and that he was still in search of a trace of them. There was nothing to be done but to wait as patiently as we could, on the chance of hearing better news. I remained in the North, by Mr. Playmore's advice, so as to be within an easy journey of Edinburgh, in case it might be necessary for me to consult him personally. 3 more weeks of weary expectation passed before a second letter reached me. This time it was impossible to say whether the news were good or bad. It might have been either: it was simply bewildering. Even Mr. Playmore himself was taken by surprise. These were the last wonderful words limited, of course, by considerations of economy which reached us, by telegram, from our agent in America. Open the dust heap in Gleninch. Chapter 42.